Okay, I'm Dan Winter again, fractalu.com, fractalfield.com. In this section, we're following up in the science of Kundalini, talking about the practical hygiene, the applications, how you do this, the diet, the lifestyle, the environment, the issues that affect your ability to attract that amount of charge and to survive that amount of lightning inhabiting your tailbone, as it were, and how it goes up your spine. And Ari here, our wonderful filmmaker from Netherlands, will be helping us with some questions and dialogues. So if we need to get more clarity, he'll help us. So this is going to be a fun conversation. So in the first part where we talked about the physics, the science of Kundalini, basically the key issue was that charge collapse, we say non-destructive charge collapse, cube octa, icosa, octa, and then tetra. There's a sequence by which charge goes through a sequence of geometries, whether it's electron shells or the houses of the zodiac. It is all about implosive collapse of charge. And you know that when an ice skater is spinning and pulls in her arms, she suddenly goes faster and faster the more she pulls in her arms. And the more she pulls in her arms and speeds up, the requirement for her to be perfectly balanced increases. Well, this is the famous Buckminster Fuller vector flexor, which I worked with him personally on this, actually. And only later do we realize that this mechanism actually describes electron shell charge collapse. And perfected charge collapse is the really meaning of the word chem as in alchemy. So this was a lovely, this is called the jitterbug. You see the cube octa, stellita tetra, and icosa. There's actually a dodeca in there somewhere, and then you have octa. And then if you just spin, you rotate like this, you have tetra. And that is a fairly good moving example of charge collapse. And charge collapse is what we're discussing because we're discussing how that feeling of spin density, when it gets in your body, as we're talking about the light ice skater, that there's a certain psychology to inhabiting increased spin. Remember, we talked about Daniel Brinkley had 2 near-death experiences from lightning, and his DNA became a superconductor, and he could feel everyone's emotions at a distance. And then Tesla had that famous lightning, high-voltage electrocution, and it changed his life because he had so many insights. He inhabited the lightning. And we talked about how when amperage, like a lightning, goes through a thread of DNA or a thread of monofilament gold, it becomes measurably a superconductor. So this is the physics, which we talked about. Now, we're getting to the psychology in this section. And the psychology is, let me see if I can come up with an illustration of the psychology that when we were in the Gurdjieff school and doing the Sufi dance, many of you have seen films of this, and there's actually there's an article in a famous magazine about the Sufi dervish turn spinning being an instruction in time, not time travel, but time compression. And the way the Sufi master teaches the spin is that there you are, you put your hand on your heart and you're holding your field, and often you're turning counterclockwise. And as you increase the speed of your spin, the Sufi master has explained to you that the proof of your having pure intention is that you did not get dizzy. Every time you think a shareable thought, call it eureka, we call it pure intention, you attract implosive charge. That's the physics. So everybody knows, oh, when I thought that thought, my hair stood up. Why did your hair stand up? I'm an electrical engineer, and I'm suggesting to you the reason your hair stood up when you had a shareable thought, makes a very good car commercial on TV, by the way, is because you imploded charge with pure intention. Yeah. Well, this is a beautiful way to ask the question. Thank you. what we're teaching love is long wave phi ratio, perfected, non-destructive embedability. What we're saying is you only fall in love with pure intention because that is the perfectly shareable wave. So don't try to fall in love with a metal building because you can't embed in it electrically. So what you're seeking when you seek pure intention is love itself, which is embeddability itself. And you know that animation of the Grail, which has the perfect Valentine in the middle when you cross the two golden spirals. It's implosive. So yes, I think we could define love as embeddability. And what's beautiful then is that gets you moving toward the sexiest concept in modern quantum physics, entanglement, which is really embeddability perfected. And they know that entanglement makes the wormholes that give you the time travel and the connectivity at a distance, all the fun stuff. So embeddability, perfect nesting, perfect entanglement, implosion due to fractality is intimately related to the concept of pure intention. And it is, we suggest strongly, electrically measurable, for example, in the measurement of the onset of coherence in your heart coherence, when your heart becomes a laser. And beautiful, all the animations and slideshows from 20 years of my work on that at realheartcoherence.com. So you can see all the stories and the slides. So, what does that have to do with Kundalini hygiene? Well, see, that's right where we're going in our conversation. In fact, you need to study about pure intention if you want to sustain Kundalini. And what that really means is that as you go about your day-to-day life, and you would like to be implosive and blissful and attract the charge named Kundalini, you actually make it a practice, a hygiene practice. Every time you're thinking, you're sitting in the car and you're musing upon a problem in your family or a problem in politics or a problem in your math, whatever kind of, and you realize that in order for that thought to be shareable, you need to be feeling the feelings of both sides of that conversation at once. This guy was the good guy and that guy was the bad guy. Do I hate the bad guy? No. What I really need to do is feel the feelings of the bad guy. And if I feel the feelings of embed and nest, then suddenly that charge inertia is then centripetal to me, which is another name for compassion. And we said we've actually done the pictures that when the EKG, electrically, the voltage we call our heartbeat, the way it's attracted to our heart has been physiologically modeled, and it is definitely a nested concentric array of donuts inside donuts. That's, the Healthy Heart is a Fractal Heart by Ari Goldberger, and the actual book on this was called When Time Breaks Down by Arthur T. Winfrey, about how fractality causes the implosion of the perfect heartbeat because harmonic inclusiveness defines immune health in heart rate variability, and that precise inclusiveness is the very electrical definition of compassion, which therefore is identical with the concept of perfect compression, which is like, I would turn myself inside out for you, darling. I mean, in the psychological literature, I think they call it the collapse process, which I think is a wonderful name for it. Because whatever agony you're going through, the process of collapsing it is to begin to see it from a bigger and bigger perspective that includes more and more people's feelings. And as you get more and more people's feelings included in your pain, suddenly the very nature of life force is to find the centripetal point where all of those problems collapse into a unified solution, which actually is what is most of benefit to all involved, which is what ancestors talk about, calling the ancestors or praying to God. These are useful metaphors. But the actual physics is the compressibility of the infinite electric library of survival information of the longitudinal fractal array, the collective unconscious communion of saints, ancestral memory. And there's an electrical process and admission ticket which allows you into that array, which is the same physics of compression that allows you into successful death. And it's absolutely a black hole. That's what successful death is. Maybe we'll do another film on that. goldenmean.info/immortality. And you'll see the symmetry sequences, Clouvet form constants, seen by near-death experiencers, and the discussion of the actual infrasound low frequencies heard by near-death experiencers and confirmed recently by someone who just died and came back. So we know that to die successfully, you need to do compression well. It's a small black hole. And that's what's required to enter this communion of saints. And interestingly, and to sustain Kundalini. And interestingly, so that's going to be elsewhere on our chart here of the hygiene for Kundalini. The magnetic line cross, which is the only place for a labyrinth, a cathedral, a cozy rev mirror, and your bliss, and birth and death, and reduced radioactive critical mass. These all live only at where the magnetic lines cross of the earth. So obviously this is the best place to do your Kundalini practice. Exactly. And it's well documented. The major sacred sites of the planet are precisely on a dodecaecosa Earth grid, for the reason that that longitudinal array is the charge distribution mechanism of the fractal field of the collective unconscious, which is now why we actually know why the pyramids had to be at those tetrahedral latitudes, which are the subset of the ecosa dodeca, because that longitudinal array was literally the distribution of the electric power without wires that Tesla promised and did not deliver. But the ancients were delivering in the pyramids originally, the piezoelectric Hummer. But that's a bit of another story. But yes, so you see that the basics, very simple dowsing skills, just walking very slowly past the energy lines, and where your fingers tingle just a little bit, you begin to immediately feel where the magnetic lines are and then where they cross. And the more you have bliss and the more you have Kundalini, the more your DNA implodes. We call it fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. The more your DNA implodes in the braiding process we call bliss, the more your DNA becomes a superconductor and the more sensitive you become. And that's another chapter in our aspects for the hygiene of Kundalini, because the more sensitive you becomes a little bit tricky. In other words, probably you're going to need to move out of the metal buildings and the bad air electrosmog of the big city eventually, or at least learn to spend time in nature somehow to get to the electrical environment where the charge implosion that we named bliss, which means you're going to be eating the electric field of your environment. And if your environment is full of geopathics and you try to have bliss, you're sucking in poison literally into your body. So seeking the place of, as Castaneda said, the place of power in every room. So seeking the place of charge compression in the room eventually intuitively enables you to find your sacred space, your altar, your place of charge leverage, the place from which you steer tornadoes, etc. Barefoot in the mud and in places where when your feet touch actual ground, I'm taking my sandals off and touching the floor here and feeling grounded. So I have by capacitive coupling, I have entered into phase lock with the charge distribution of the earth, the Schumann harmonics of which are the definition of the brainwave harmonics and the sacrocranial harmonics that enable bliss and Kundalini. So obviously getting into phase with the earth is absolutely essential, for sure. And the Schumann 8 hertz, for example, is the beginning of all alpha and all bliss, and trained to the 0.1 hertz of the Mayer wave of the sacrocranial. So grounding, which means also probably that you may want to look at getting the kind of shoes that enable you to absorb more charge from the earth. Real thick rubber soles, although they cushion your bones pretty well, unfortunately, they charge isolate you. So if you're spending all day with thick synthetic shoes on concrete with rebar in it, your body will never, ever get grounded, will never, ever be able to tune in the Schumann harmonic, and you will not get alpha and you will not get bliss. I guess we need to talk about that a little bit. I wanted to explain something here that, my partner here is actually doing fasting very frequently, and she's very disciplined. It's amazing. And she's in pursuit of bliss experience with incredible, will, which is a beautiful thing. And so what is, do you need to starve yourself to death, or do you need to eat high quality protein? What do you need for Kundalini? Well, the short answer is both. So see, Kundalini is built on the physics of the fact that you had some high quality nutrition to build the blue fire in the cells. For example, for me, I'm able to absorb a small amount of seafood right now. It's a little bit of shrimp sometimes. And I get my high quality protein sometimes there. And it's tricky to get good shrimp, just like any high quality protein is going to be tricky. But if you can find a happy egg or a happy cow or a happy shrimp, and there are very few, you might get some happy protein. But when you have high quality protein, that increases the amount of blue fire in cells. Now, in my case, after 30 years of Kundalini, I have a incredibly and tricky, super fast metabolism. And so I find, for example, if I eat some high quality shrimp, then the blue fire builds more quickly, actually. And I can actually feel that ultraviolet coherence, and I can use that blue fire. Whereas if I fast, I feel dizzy and ungrounded and unable to bring it down and focus it. But I'd like to talk about this diet in relationship to the intestines, for example. So that, remember that after the cells have ultraviolet density, the blue fire is starting to build in the blue cup at the tailbone, then it is better if the intestines are mostly empty, at least the lower intestine, because then the ultraviolet can make the turn. So you very rarely will actually complete much bliss process when your stomach is full. Your body needs all its energy. So it's a tricky part. There's a certain period when digestion has happened and the blue fire is available, and then there is the space for the U-turn that blue fire has to make at the tailbone. And during that time, of course, an enema is helpful. Cleansing the intestine, and they say ayahuasca, there's lots of ways to cleanse. But the fact is then, if your body has a clear path at the tailbone, and then you do that pelvic tilt, so you've cleared the intestine, and you've eaten live food, because the live enzymes accelerate that digestion rate. And remember, perfected digestion rate is the climax of the blue flame. So if you're eating synthetics or processed food or food that lacks live enzymes, you're really not going to make it. We cannot emphasize enough the live enzyme issue. Study live enzymes. Basically, pickles and olives and yogurt, and the stuff that gives you, if you can do a little dairy, the yogurt, but work on the live enzymes, which basically means live food. And if you, like, it's winter time here, we're not going to eat all raw food. It's good to have a salad, but you need some. So then the veggies are steamed briefly or sautéed briefly, but not overcooked. So there's still some enzymes in there. And you eat a lot of pickles and vinegars and, so live food, enzymes, flame of the mind diet. And just the other thing to say as we conclude the diet section is, how we said when you go to the grocery store, you're asking each piece of broccoli, when was the last time you knew genetic diversity? The broccoli might have known some genetic diversity in the last 1,000 years. Unfortunately, if you ask your wheat or your corn or your soy, when was the last time you knew genetic diversity, they're going to scream in pain back at you and say, oh hell, I haven't known genetic diversity in 1,000 years or hundreds of years. And therefore, the DNA in that wheat, corn, and soy that has been monocultured are going to cause mucus, which is your body saying, not self, not self, not self. That's what the mucus is, which prevents the plasma flame to get dense. Well, The story that comes to mind is I was living near Twyla Niche of the Seneca Indians in western New York, and they came and put an heirloom seeds garden near the labyrinth in the trees circle at my farm. And we had 7 different color beans and 7 different color tomatoes and potatoes. I mean, we had extreme genetic diversity. And the elementals in that garden were having a riot. I mean, they were so happy. There was games and fun going on in the elementals. Anybody's a little bit clairvoyant. And then my friends from the city came out. And it was Vince. It's a funny story. But basically what they said was, we don't need LSD anymore. We'll just eat these vegetables. What? And it's true. If the vegetables have been having enough bliss experience, you're going to reduce your bill for LSD because you get that. You close your eyes and you see the psychedelic experience that these vegetables have been having. That's called extreme genetic diversity. I'll give you another example. When I was living with Susan Ambrose, wonderful shaman there, St. Mary's Glacier outside of Boulder. And she had been living with the Hopi, grandfather Dan. And she had this, I think it was blue cornmeal. And that's the same blue corn that would only germinate if you sang the right song to it. Extreme genetic diversity, hundreds of generations, and it was the family pet. This DNA was a family pet. It was like your dog that call you in. It knows your name. And that I saw many times, that cornmeal call the wind. I know exactly why. I know the physics of why that cornmeal could call the wind. The plasma entities, they just came over to play. It was wonderful. Well, that cornmeal. Well, that is the opposite of any corn you can buy in your store today, sadly. So the corn in your store today, sadly, mostly, I have to say, I believe is actually functionally a poison because of monoculture. Let's call it the Monsanto mistake. But we're saying that when you're thinking about your diet and you're looking for genetic diversity, this is going to enable you to choose foods that are not so mucus forming and actually feed the flame. Basically, you're sitting there and you're starting to have a little bliss, and then if you have intense bliss, it's actually charged, obviously. It feels like lightning. It is lightning. And that will stress the mineral to water bonds in your body. And hydration is basically a name for the fractality that is hydrogen. I proved it was fractal. I wrote the new equation. Planck times golden ratio equals hydrogen radii. New information. It's fractal. That's how it makes gravity. But that's also how the hydrogen in water makes charge distribution possible. So your body is, 90-some% water. And so to keep the charge distribution going in your body, hydration with live water is so critical. And incidentally, it's the same thing with Therify plasma. We can feed this Therify phase conjugate plasma into the body and heal all kinds of stuff. Rejuvenation, because we're just adding spin and making it centripetal. But the limiting factor in every case is hydration and grounding. So as soon as you get out of the intense charge of the Therify, or as soon as you get out of the intense charge of your Kundalini, go have some excellent spring water with lemon, and you will feel it. So, and the symptom of too much Therify, and the symptom of too much Kundalini, one of the prime is dehydration. Which, by the way, what is a symptom of aging? Dehydration. When the solubility of that water has to do with the spin density in the water, and I have spent a lifetime on spin density in water, you might want to look at theimploder.com and our perfected vortex technology. So, we're mentioning remineralization and hydration, and maybe taking the trace minerals. I do. I take my trace minerals and vitamins, etc., to keep the hydration and grounding when the lightning hits. So actually, this introduces the whole concept of the need for biologic architecture. In summary, if you're in a building made mostly of aluminum and steel, and there's lots of electrosmog and bad air, you don't have much chance of having, if not sustaining, Kundalini. So the opposite of that is the building is made of high dielectric material, say fractal, which means biologic material, mostly wood and naturally occurring. It was the Steiner people got that right. The children should only touch natural fibers natural wood and natural stone, and the children should never touch anything else. You know why the Steiner school tells you that? They're right about the physics, because the aura of that child cannot inhabit that which is not high dielectric. And remember, every molecule that joins the expensive club called life saw the bumper sticker at the door which says get fractal or get dead, which means that the charge distribution efficiency, called fractality, enables charge distribution, called high dielectric constant, which means in biologic architecture, if the house is made of wood and natural fabric and stone, your aura can breathe. And if it's the opposite of that, steel and aluminum, your aura is trapped. And negative ion wind therapy, plasma therapy, therapy.net, and Bliss and Kundalini, all of these things require exactly what we're talking about, an environment in which charge distribution is permissive. Yeah, it's too bad. In our biologic architecture curriculum, which we think is the most advanced biologic architecture curriculum on the planet, and in practice in more countries than any other, goldenmean.info/architecture. We have partners all over the world. And for example, we throw 3 different ways to measure in advance whether or not a building will cause a seed to grow, and therefore enable a child to have a soul, and therefore which architect deserves to get a paycheck. And we show 3 different ways to measure in advance whether that building is going to make a seed grow, which is that charge implosion that's called fertility. And that same ability to be centripetal electrically determines whether your child can keep his soul in their school. So if you're sending a child to a metal and electrosmog aluminum school building every day with dead air, there's a bit of karma there. So Ari spent a lot of time working with Tai Chi and Qigong, yes. Dance, yes. And so we all know that a lot of that process, they call it attracting Qi, has to do with the geometry of movement in such a way that when you finish the movement, you feel a tingle of charge. Now, if we were to study the physics of what that is, how to attract Qi, if I'm an electrical engineer and I want to teach electrical engineers how to attract Qi, I'm going to have to do the electrical engineering of that conversation, which I think we can do beautifully. So here's a movement where not only am I doing a rather perfect spiral, but also I'm changing velocity at a contiguous rate. And hopefully I did it in place. But definitely right now I feel a dramatic tingle at my fingertip, for sure. So in other words, I knew the calculus of curvature intuitively that would attract implosive capacitance. And it's true, implosive capacitance, that spin density, is literally what Qi is about. Which is why we have to have a unified field viewpoint on this. You know, whether we call it Qi, Orgone, Baraka, or Shaktipat. Sorry guys, it's a unified field. We don't need more names. We need a unified language, which I think physics works pretty well, and actually adds to the romance of spiritual conversation by using physics. And so to understand that the amount of centripetal force, which is your attention, increases. So look for the amount of centripetal force in your attention to increase as you increase your capacity for bliss. For example, someone says, I need healing, and you put your hand on there, and if their blood comes to the surface, it gets pink, and this is called vasodilation, and your charge has imploded. And as the charge density, centripetal inertia of your attention increases, your ability to throw your weight around, which is to say, throw your centripetal force. Remember, the name for mass is spin. You store the amount of, you measure the amount of inertia stored by rotation, and you call that mass. You measure the period, you call that time. So it's all about storing spin, however you want to language it. That is the unified field, the spin of charge. So your ability to gather that charge and bring it to a centripetal focus is precisely the evolution of consciousness and precisely the evolution of bliss and precisely what Kundalini can feed, which means you can heal situations and people. You walk into a room and just your presence helps heal. This is because your aura has become more centripetal. And yes, you experiment with placing your attention anywhere you choose, and you grow that just like you would a muscle. Let me give you an example of a physicist discussing mudra. In mudra, remember we said that cellular metabolism is radiating a 1.91 angstrom wavelength, which is phase conjugate to Planck by my equation golden ratio of the adenosine diphosphate ATP-ADP bond. It's a teeter-totter. So we know where cellular fire is generated in cell metabolism. And now, supposing we want to focus that fire and distribute it. Here's mudra. In mudra, if you hold your fingers like this, I can feel my aura speeding up right now. My chakras are burning, my nibs is tingling. And now I say, oops, I want to slow that down. Now I do this. It did slow down a bit, actually. Why did it slow down? Do you see the difference? This speeded it up. This slowed it down. What's the physics? The physics is that this geometry is more pent, and this geometry is more hex. It's actually true if you count the number of bonds. and that physics, the hex you see is charge stasis, tetracubic. In the edge length ratios are all square root of 2, which is maximizes charge destructive charge interference, which means it freezes. Any ice crystal can tell you that. It's hex. And any witch can tell you that. You know, the hex freezes the spell. The pent sends the spell. Well, the physics is charge implosion pent versus charge stasis hex. So that is an example, just introducing you to ways to think about the physics of mudra. So when you're doing these postures, for example, there's a phonon component, a long wave, sound wave. The standing wave of the spine liquid pump, we talked about that at length in the science intersect. And then there's a shortwave aspect, the microwave aspect. And if all of these are in phase, you're actually beginning to understand how you invite implosion when you want to. I was going to use the example, which I think helps with your question. When we were teaching the Castaneda famous tensegrity, in many of the courses we did in Italy, and I want to thank Valerie for that help. One of the movements we would often show was you're standing there and you reach down and you pull your aura out of the earth just like you're picking a carrot. And then, this is a famous Castaneda tense. You go up here like this and you go, okay. Now, what just happened? Well, first of all, I felt a huge rush up there, okay? And what did I do? I unplugged my aura from the earth and I projected it. Plasma projection is the electrical definition of Shem An, literally raising of the Jed. If you would like to be a Jedi. And the Jed stones we saw are golden ratio, and they're plasma projective. So, studying the physics of how you use movement to project your aura, project a bubble of plasma, which you then inhabit. And that then introduces the science which we've been working at for over 5 years now, which is if you understand when your body has imploded and compressed in the pine cones, kiss noses, that transverse EMF inertia translates vorticity, goes down to where the pine cones kiss noses at the Planck threshold, and the up and down motion, transverse EMF, has become folded into compressional longitudinal inertia. And that longitudinal EMF in physics, action at a distance, superluminal component, the wave mechanics of the collective unconscious, and where you go when you lucid dream or die or astral project. Another reason why it's helpful if you start at a magnetic line cross of the earth, what Castaneda called the place of power, because from there you can gather the inertia of that longitudinal coherence and throw your weight around. And we believe, for example, that the golden ratio cascade, we can now tune in brainwaves to Planck, flameinmind.com, which is how you teach remote viewing and astral projection. And we've been showing the Monroe Institute some things. I think they're going to start to, even Bob Monroe got all freaked out when Dr. what's his name, first was there and discovered golden ratio heterodynes in the audio pushed people rapidly out of their body. And at first they thought it was dangerous. Well, it's implosive. And so, but when you make the right golden ratio phonon cascade called the perfect binaural beat for bliss, flameinmind.com/flameinsound, and I think everybody now agrees we have the most powerful binaural beats for bliss. And what do? We took that phonon cascade of perfect brainwaves, and we made that phonon cascade perfectly 180 degrees out of phase to phase conjugate. And can that be ungrounding and dangerous? Yes, if you're not grounded. But if you can focus and have discipline, you can ride that wave and enter the longitudinal array, which is fractal. There's a very short answer. Sometimes you walk on water, and sometimes you take a bridge. If you've got a lot of inertia and you're feeling really good, you can probably get your bliss fires going. But if you want to make it easier, if you want to get started, or if you're needing more inertia, then look for a magnetic line cross, because it will help. Every sacred site, Machu Picchu, they're all on dodecahedrons of grid nodes because they all needed longitudinal inertia. Even Kozyrev's telepathy would never work unless they're right at the crosses of these lines. Giza and, the Michael line, they all respect the physics here, which is the longitudinal interferometry, which is the actual correct name. So we kind of talked about that already. We now understand that if you develop the discipline in your life to reduce every experience to pure principle. Notice me in this conversation. Every time we come to a question, I reduce it to simple, pure wave mechanics, essentially. It transcends politics, it transcends religion. It's the essence of physics, which is pure wave mechanics. How would waves interfere in principle? If you understand, then you understand the love of the collective unconscious, because that is a survival library of information that is made of spin density. To get in there, you need to do compression very well, called get fractal or get dead. So we understand now that you think about everything in terms of pure principle, and then when bad things happen to you or when good things happen to you, you can think, well, the lesson behind this was, the pure principle in physics behind this was, the essence of this situation was, how 10,000 generations of my ancestors will look at this in perspective was, this is essence, this is pure principle, this is what the gene pool has learned from you. And if you can be there with that new survival spin information, eureka, pure principle, essence, and see that in everything, and look for that every time you look around. I'm looking for pure principle. Do I see any pure principle over there? Do I see any new lesson in physics for the universe? Have I become a better shareable? You get the idea. Shareable wave. I had a roommate in college. Actually, his name is Peter. I love him. He's a really amazing guy. And he was delivering furniture one day, and he had been studying Buddhistic detachment. He was so I think the furniture falls over the porch railing and crashes, and the lady receiving the furniture is screaming at him, and he is absolutely detached, like, they're pure. Now, is that the kind of detachment you need? Well, I always think there was a difference between the Buddha, who said detach from everything, basically, and Gurdjieff, who said no, you must inhabit the sting of the moment, which is the opposite of detachment. So it is detachment in this sense. It isn't ungrounding. It is rather seeing through to the pure principle. So it isn't so much as detachment, is at seeing the meaning in depth. So if you see in depth the meaning of the situation, because, you know, what is how the Buddhists would say, all pain comes from attachment. Well, exactly. Dissociation is kind of the name for schizophrenia. And so I was like, well, so obviously that's not the only goal here. It's rather like the physicists who, after scratching their head for 1,000 years, finally start scratching their head and said, maybe consciousness is the electric field around the brain and not the brain itself. Well, that's good. Are they getting detached? What has been detached? Well, how did you generate the inertia of the imploding plasma donut around your head, whose organ of perception you call consciousness? That's the wormhole you look through if you're a kid seeing without their eyes, you know. Obviously, that's what perception is. So have they gotten detached? Well, they've discovered that immortality lies in the spin of that charge, which arises from the nest of matter, but it's actually the energy field which is inhabited. Now, if that's not detachment, actually what it is identifying with what is in fact immortal, which is the spin itself, which is what you take with you after death. And that's the practical physics for why you measure your aura before and after you make any decision in life. Which broccoli shall I eat? Whom shall I kiss? You know, measure my aura before and after. Which vaccine should I take? Measure my aura before and after. Once you know that your aura, the measure of your heart's fractality, is the only thing you take with you to get an immune system and to survive death. So obviously, that's important. So essentially, when the Native Americans were saying, everything you see and do and touch, you say, gratitude, gratitude, gratitude to Wakantanka, you know, gratitude to the collective mind, gratitude to the Holy Ghost, gratitude. What you're saying when you do that is, I choose embeddability. I choose to embed myself in the spin of the divine, that perfect fractal array, and therefore charge comes to you. You implode. Thank you very much.